Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavati Tamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. And good morning. Well, hardly need a lecture. I think the song said it all. But we'll say a few words anyway. You know, there are two different ideas about how we need to approach spiritual life. The Buddhists didn't think we needed to worry about how we got here, and Swami Atmavidyananda used to tell the story of the man who was shot by an arrow and started asking, well, how did it get here, and who shot it, and how old was the person, and why did they do it, and blah, blah, blah. And the Buddhists say, you know, you don't need to know all of that. All you need is for someone to take the arrow out. But if you're wandering through a jungle and you don't know where the path goes, you'd better know how you got to where you are in the middle of the jungle or you won't get out. So sometimes it's helpful to know how we've gotten into our situation in order to help us get out. And so this morning we're going to analyze some of the aspects of how our sense organs work. Several people asked me, well, what are you going to talk about? Some people thought I was going to talk about extrasensory perception, things that you somehow perceive without your sense organs. And other people thought I was going to talk about their lungs and their livers and their hearts that weren't sense organs. But no, we're going to talk about our regular sense organs, but how in some sense they present a world that's not accurate, that they are, that what they're telling us is, from the spiritual standpoint, nonsense. So let's first of all look at some of the other references in scriptures about our sense organs. We've already heard one sung this morning, but in the Kena Upanishad it says, at whose behest does the mind think? Who bids the body live? Who makes the tongue speak? Who is that effulgent being that directs the eye to form and color and the ear to sound? The self, with a capital S, referring to the Atman or Brahman, is the ear of the ear, the mind of the mind, the speech of the speech. He is also the breath of the breath and the eye of the eye. That which cannot be expressed in words, but by which the tongue speaks. Know that to be Brahman. Brahman is not the being who is worshipped of men. That which is not comprehended by the mind, but by which the mind comprehends. Know that to be Brahman. Brahman is not the being who is worshipped of men. And it goes on and on like this, going through various sense organs and functions of our being. So Brahman is the power behind the senses. That Brahman is beginningless, transcendent, eternal. He is said to be equally beyond what is and what is not. Everywhere are his hands, eyes, feet, his heads and his faces. The whole world is his ears. He exists encompassing all things, doing the task of each sense, yet himself devoid of the senses. Standing apart, he sustains. He is free from the gunas, but feels them. He is within and without. So we have this sort of paradoxical view of how difficult Brahman is to understand as being that which is behind and supportive of all the senses, but not the senses. He who realizes the existence of Brahman behind every activity of his being, whether sensation, perception, or thought, he alone gains immortality. Through knowledge of Brahman comes power. Through knowledge of Brahman comes victory over death. And in the Bhagavad Gita it says, this entire universe is pervaded by me, and that eternal form of mind which is not manifest to the senses. So you see, our sense organs bring signals to our brains, which gives us a perception of the world, but not of Brahman directly. It's more like a virtual reality show. Does anybody have an Oculus thing, or know somebody that does and has had a chance to look at it, and you put these goggles on and you're put into this world that you can turn around, and you turn around in this virtual world. It's very interesting. So it's creating this whole virtual reality in your head, and really our minds and sense organs are doing that all the time. Again, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says, "Truly the admirable person controls his senses by the power of his will. All his actions are disinterested. All are directed along the path to union with Brahman. Renounce all your desires forever. They spring from willfulness. Use your discrimination to restrain the whole pack of the scattering senses." And both in the Gita and the Upanishad, you get the metaphor of the charioteer and the rider and so forth. The idea is that the self, or the Atman, is the rider, the body is the chariot, and the intellect is the charioteer, and the mind are the reins. The senses, say the wise, are the horses. The roads they travel are the mazes of desire. The wise call the self, the Atman, the enjoyer, when he is united with the body, the senses, and the mind. And it goes on and says, when a man lacks discrimination and his mind is uncontrolled, his senses are unmanageable, like the restive horses of a charioteer. But when a man has discrimination and his mind is controlled, his senses, like the well-broken horses of a charioteer, lightly obey the rein. So you see, we should, if we don't have control over our senses, we should feel as terrified as if we were in a chariot with wild horses and no reins. We've lost the reins, or they've broken. Or a more updated example might be, we've bought one of those voice-activated cars. It sort of drives itself. You just tell it where you go. But unfortunately, this was built in a foreign country and only responds to a foreign language. And everything you say is reinterpreted as close as it can get to words in that language, and God knows where you're going to end up. So we should be as terrified as that if we're not in control of our senses. Also, we become suckers for advertisers. Advertisers have studied how the mind works. They know how the mind works, and they have figured out how to get to you and to get you to buy their products, to get you to want their products, to get you to desire their products beyond anything you really need. So, we need to be like Nachiketa. It says, "Oh, Nachiketa, having looked upon fleshly desires delightful to the senses, you have renounced them all. Thou hast turned from the mire way wherein many a man wallows." So we need to be able to discriminate between how the mind works and what we really want in life. When a man lacks discrimination, the Katha Upanishad goes on to say, his mind is uncontrolled and the senses unmanageable. You see, for centuries, many philosophers, especially in the West, have equated reality with what we can perceive. We're going to start our philosophy with what we know to be true, which is what we know through our senses. But now that science has progressed a bit, we understand that our sense organs don't just present what's out there. It's a rather complicated process. We have to remember that Brahman is the reality, and what our senses perceive is a show presented by Maya, sort of like MGM, presented by Maya, here's your show. And the mind and the senses are slaves of the ego and our DNA programming. Our DNA is programmed for us to survive. And we're all descendant from organisms that have survived. None of us spontaneously arose from a pond when lightning struck. We all come from a long line of people that managed to survive long enough to have kids. So from the standpoint of our spiritual realizations, our sense organs have become nonsense organs. They're not leading us in the right direction. they're not presenting Brahman in a form where we recognize its true nature. From the standpoint of functioning in this world, however, they're very clever, and they do a very good job. But in order to do this job, they have to take shortcuts. And because they're taking shortcuts, and because of the way the mind has to be programmed for us to survive, we can easily be fooled by what's out there. And we have to understand that even when we're not being fooled, that it's just a particular perspective that we're getting through our sense organs. You see, each one of us has grown up in a particular environment. We have a particular DNA makeup. We have a culture that we've grown up with. We've had family and so forth. And all of these things influence how our particular mind works. And what we need to understand is that all of this presents reality in a particular way. Our whole mental outlook on life presents reality in a particular way. Let's take a little thought experiment. Suppose we brought in various painters from throughout history and throughout different cultures. So you bring someone from the Cubist tradition and someone from the Impressionistic tradition and maybe the Italian Renaissance and the medieval period, and then you bring in people from other cultures, Japanese artists and Chinese artists and cave painters in some ancient culture, and you ask them to paint a picture for you of some scene in nature. And everything you see, well, you can kind of tell that it's a picture of what they were painting, but they're all going to be very different. They're going to be different images. And it's like that. Each one of us has sort of a mental painter in our mind that paints a particular picture of reality. The Gita says, when understanding shines in through the senses, the doors of the body, know that sattva is present. So it's not a totally lost cause. There is a revealing aspect to what it is that we see in this world, but we have to understand its limitations and how it works. And it goes on to say that the attractions and aversions which the senses feel for different objects are natural, but you must not give way to such feelings. They are obstacles. All right, so let's see. So our sense organs, although they don't present Brahman as Brahman is, because Brahman really is beyond the senses, we have to realize that they're designed for survival. And so our sense organs help us find food and find shelter and help us to reproduce so that the DNA of the species are continued. They take energy input in and create an interpretation of it. But we have to realize that there's an infinite number of possibilities for these energy frequencies that are coming in. Let's just take light, for example. We only see a very limited part of the light spectrum, but even in that limited part of the light spectrum, although we tend to break it up into pieces, you might say that there are 7 colors, or we might say that we see from some frequency in the 600s up to, I forget what it is, 1400 or something. You have to remember that those are just digital breakings up. We could say that a red light is 660, but how about 660.1255956 ... That's a perfectly good wavelength too. So how could your eyes and your brain possibly be programmed to interpret an infinite number of possible spectral lines that we can perceive in the visible spectrum? Not to mention the infrared and the ultraviolet and the X-rays and so forth and so on, which we don't perceive at all with our eyes. And so you see, our eyes are very limited and our brains are very limited in how we can interpret the sensory input that's coming in. Now we, almost universally in the human species, we have 3 color receptors. Some people have fewer, and I think there are a couple of rare examples where people actually have a 4th. But these 3 different color receptors interpret what you're seeing by taking the logarithm of the differences in between these two frequencies, and they compare these frequencies in these three cones. So a light frequency enters here, the three cones are stimulated, and your brain takes the logarithm of the numbers that it gets, and by subtracting those things, it can figure out the ratios between it, and then it tells you, oh, you've seen a red light, or you've seen a yellow light, or a bluish-green light, or whatever it is. So that's how your eye does it. It sort of interprets things. And of course, painters and artists and lighting specialists and so forth have to know how all these things work, because they have to know how to mix colors so that they can get you to think that you're seeing a particular color. So sound waves is also the same thing. Again, we could say that concert A is 440 vibrations per second, but that wasn't always that way. Sometimes it was said to be 409 or 422.5 or 423.2. We found tuning forks going back into the 1700s, 1600s maybe, that have these different pitches, and they're all marked A, concert A. So what we interpret as an A has a kind of a broad spectrum to it. And again, you could think, well, it could have been 423.956214, whatever, and go on and on forever. So there's an infinite number of possible vibrations for sound, and your ear has to interpret those some way and come up with an idea of what it is that you're hearing. And again, it goes through a complex mathematical process. You didn't know you were good at math, did you? You're very good at math. You do it all very automatically. It takes what's called a Fourier transform and figures out what's going on in there and breaks it all up into individual sine waves. So our sensory systems gather a tremendous amount of information very quickly, and even more impressively, our brains almost instantly relate this income to information that we've previously known and give it an interpretation. But you see, that's going to be subject to error and subject to differences depending on whose brain it is that's doing this. This is a massively complex yet flexible, automatic, and interactive, accurate perception that's going on all the time that you're not really even aware that you're having to do. So your sense organs in your brain are really doing a very remarkable job in this respect. So how does it do it? Well, it does it by being inferential, basically. Your brain makes educated guesses about the state of the world that is being presented to it by the sense organs. And it's those educated guesses that you perceive, not the input itself. So you see, we have, first of all, Brahman is the existence behind everything, and then we've made the mistake to see it as in pairs of opposites in a world that seems to be manifesting in space and time with causation, with laws of gravity, electricity, and inertia. And then on top of that illusion, our sense organs then interpret the energies that come from this basic mistake and interpret that through our sense organs, presenting that to the brain. So a lot of this inferences that the brain does is occurring automatically and very rapidly and outside of our conscious awareness. Is based on extremely complex relationships between different sources of information, starting at the level of the sensory organs themselves. Now, there's an interesting test, cleverly called the RSVP test, which stands for Rapid Serial Visual Presentation, which makes clear just how remarkable and impressive our human perception is. What they do is they present images very rapidly, as the name implied, to subjects at about 10 pictures per second. And after several repetitions through the series, the subject is asked to write down what he or she saw. And most people can remember almost all the images that they saw, even though they only saw them for a tenth of a second. Another variation of this is where they present a whole bunch of images, some of which have images of cars, of all different kinds of cars. It might be an actual photograph of a car, or it might be a cartoon of a car, or just a sketch of a car, or an outline, so forth. And this is presented in the same rapid fashion, and people are asked to push a button every time they see a car. And people, again, are very good at this, up to about a tenth of a second. If you get twice as fast as that, our ability to respond becomes much worse, and eventually we go beyond our capacity to recognize things. So that our system isn't infinitely fast. But it's interesting to find out that so far scientists have not encountered any other information processing system capable of these speeds other than the human brain. There's no supercomputer, no other animals, nothing in the entire universe of scientific exploration, at least, that we have found so far that can match your brain. Now, we, of course, have the same remarkable ability with our ears, too. Just think of what your hearing and your brain has to do in a crowded restaurant where you've got people talking at all the different tables and you're trying to tune into the conversation of the person just across from you. Sometimes it's very challenging, but somehow we manage to get most of the information in. Somehow our brain can take this massive sound waves coming in and parse out what it is we want to hear by tuning into the quality of the voice and the direction that it's coming from. Not an easy task at all. If you tried to ask a computer to do that, it would get very confused. And of course, computers are getting better at recognizing speech, but I'm sure we've all gotten frustrated with those automatic machines that want you to say your name and give your social security number or something, and they never get it right. You know, who do you want to talk to? What department? I don't understand that. So we get very frustrated with these computers that can't do what we humans do quite easily. It's really remarkable when you think of it. And of course, we get a little bit of understanding of how good we are at this in our native language when we study a foreign language. And suddenly the words seem to kind of blur together. It's hard for us to distinguish exactly what people are saying. It seems like they're talking really fast. And it's just because we're not used to dividing up the words. I'm talking in one continuous stream. I don't have to separate all my words like that for you to understand me. You can figure out which words are which and parse them up individually. But it's very difficult to program a computer like that. Now, of course, again, we have our limitations, as the cute little song of, I don't know, must have been 100 years ago, mares eat oats and does eat oats and the lambs eat ivy. Now, it sounds like gibberish, but the words are mares eat oats and does eat oats. And so if you say it slowly and separate them, you can make sense out of it. But you say it real fast and it sounds kind of like just funny talk. So, as with vision and hearing, it feels so effortless and so simple, and yet when we try to duplicate it, we find that it's extremely complex and quite amazing. So our senses, you see, are tuned into the Maya channel, and it deals very effectively in a very practical way with this universe of the senses. It's this cosmic illusion, this cosmic reality show that our sense organs are perceiving. Now, just as a human magician, when he puts on a show or she puts on a show, they want to distract us from what they're really doing so that you will think they're doing something else. And they take advantage of some of these, the ways our perceptions work in order for us to do that. So Mahamaya, the great magician of the universe, does the same things. She turns, as it says again in the Katha Upanishad, the self-existent one made the senses turn outward. Accordingly, man looks what is without and sees what not is within. Rare is he, longing for immortality, that shuts his eyes to find out what is to shut his eyes to what is without, and beholds the self within. So you see, Maya is distracting us, just like a magician would. In a magic show, if the magician doesn't want you to see him reaching into his pocket over here, he does some grand gesture over here. Why does he do that? Well, because our sense organs are programmed for survival, and one thing you need to do in survival is to see things that move. If it moves, it might be food, or you might be food for it. And so it's important for your survival that you see things that move. So our eyes immediately go to things that are moving. And it becomes very distracting to us. So our sense organs and our DNA are all programmed to give us this ego sense, this sense of I-ness, that I am this and there's this object out there. As the Gita says, man is deluded by then his egotism and thinks, I am the doer. But he who has the true insight into the operations of the gunas and their functions know that when the senses attach themselves to objects, gunas are merely attaching themselves to gunas. Knowing this, he does not become attached to his actions. So you see, if we understand that our sense organs are programmed to see things in this environment for specific reasons, we can just accept the fact that they're doing that, but not get attached to these things. So our sense organs, while it gives a fantastic show, they're limited. And we, just like Maya, we can't say that Maya is unreal or real. We can't really say that our sense organs are accurate or inaccurate. They're just more or less accurate. They give us a more or less accurate opinion. Again, take an example from your eyes. Some of us wear glasses. If without our glasses, we still see things, and it's somewhat accurate, but it's more accurate this way. And if you get LASIK surgery and they make your vision 2015 instead of 2020, then you can even see better. Or if you use a telescope or a microscope, you can see a lot better in certain situations. Or you wear night vision goggles, so we can extend our senses in various ways. And so become more and more accurate, or perhaps less and less accurate as our cataracts get worse and things like that. So it's not that it's accurate or inaccurate, it's just a sort of a mixture in between. So what we experience is a particular representation or a particular reflection of an underlying reality, but it's distorted and it's limited by the sense organs and then the interpretation which the mind gives to it after that. Back to our color vision. You see, we have, most of us, 3 cones. If you're red-green colorblind, you might only have 2 cones. And so you see the world of color very differently than someone with 3 cones. Then consider the situation of some of the animals that have 4 cones. Some of them have 4 cones, and we have no way to even imagine what that would look like and how the colors would change. Some of these tetrachromacies exist in birds and fish and amphibians and reptiles and so forth. So the way our eyes are set up, it influences how we see the universe. Our emotions also change our perception of the universe. And we've probably all experienced this. Some of us have good, I'm sure all of us have good days and bad days, where we're in good moods or bad moods. And as our mood dictates, things that might seem trivial or unimportant might seem major on a day when we're just really feeling tired and worn down or depressed. Little things become huge problems for us. And if we're feeling great, then we just kind of laugh things off. We can laugh at all sorts of things and just think it's all fun. There's an interesting story about this rider on a train observed that there was this one man that had a T-shirt on. Then on the back of the T-shirt there was a picture of a man running and a dog running after him. And he overheard this one very depressed lady say, "Wow, why would anyone wear a picture of a dog chasing a man like that?" And another person thought it looked really inviting that they were out having a good run in the park on a pretty day. So depending on whether you're depressed or happy, you see things differently. You perceive things differently. as we also have mentioned in the past, Brahman is the one world, but we're perceiving it as many. And it does this by making us perceive things in pairs of opposites. And this is interesting, and we'll see this when we, at the end, we're going to look at some pictures. Our brain is programmed to see things by comparison. So, for example, we have visual neurons that respond to upward motion and other neurons that respond to downward motion. And they inhibit each other. So, if you, for example, are looking at a waterfall where the water is falling down like this, and you stare at it for several minutes, then as you walk away, it looks like the trees are all moving up. Because as you look at the waterfall, you're tiring out the neurons that perceive things going down, and the neurons that see things going up are getting a total rest. And so as you turn away, the tired out downward responding neurons think, oh, I don't have to work anymore. And they don't inhibit the upward looking neurons, and the upward neurons turn on and are having a field day, and it looks like things that are not going up, it makes them look like they're going up. And of course, there's the idea of after images too, where if you stare at a particular color and then you look away at a neutral background, you will see its complementary color, because the neurons that are responding to the one color are tired, and the ones that respond to the oppositional color are not tired, and so when you look away, those turn on. And so in this interesting way, we find that we can fatigue certain sets of neurons, and then the opposite set of neurons will then fire up if you turn to a different way. It's like there's a tug-of-war between sets of neurons, and if one gets tired, then they can't keep up the tug-of-war, and they lose out to the other ones. Our neurons can exhibit 100 action potentials per second, or they may go several minutes between action potentials. So they have a large spectrum of abilities to respond to our environment. But even so, our neurons seem awfully simple to be able to calculate all the sense perceptions and the things we think and feel. Their power, of course, comes from their numbers. Hundreds of billions of neurons with hundreds of trillions of synapses, so many we can't really know the exact number. But it's an amazing array of neurons that are bringing this programming into our minds and creating a reality. There's another interesting experiment as to how our mind and our sense organs work together and yet can be fooled. Sometimes our minds interpret something that's happening from an appearance. So, for example, there's what's called the rubber hand illusion. Perhaps you've seen this on the internet or on a TV program on perception, where they have you put your hand in a box that you can't see, and then they put a rubber hand that looks just like your hand right outside the box. And then they tickle your hand and the rubber hand simultaneously for some time. So every time you feel a stimulus on your hand, you're seeing a stimulus on the rubber hand. Pretty soon your brain starts to identify with the rubber hand. And so even tickling the rubber hand, your hand starts to feel tickled. And then what the experimenter does, they take a hammer out and they go like that on the rubber hand, and you go like this. That's how bad it is. Your idea of what you are has been totally programmed in to think that you're that rubber hand. And so you see how easily we can be fooled into thinking that we're something that we're not. So the fact that our sense organs are bringing all this stimulation into this brain of ours, which we've then identified with this body and this mind, we're so identified with this body and this mind, it's very difficult to break that kind of identification. But you can see it's just a process that the brain has done. The brain has created this process that we're this body and this mind, again, in order for us to survive, in order for us to find food, in order for us to find shelter, in order for us not to become food, in order for us to have offspring. Now, one thing that's very important for survival is to be able to identify friends from enemies. You have to know who's your family, who's your tribe, and who's not, who's likely to come to try to take you away or kill you or take away things from you, and who's going to supply things for you and be cooperative. So we're programmed to see faces, and we're very good at seeing faces, especially of the kinds of people that we're used to seeing. Now, if you're lucky enough to be raised in an environment like California or New York or someplace where there are all sorts of different kinds of people, then you get very good at recognizing people from all different cultures and all different races. If you grow up in a very homogeneous area where you almost never see anybody that's different from you, then it becomes very difficult for you to see the differences between people. They just all look like somebody of a different group. So if you're an African American and you grew up in Africa and you see almost all African, or not African Americans, but Africans, and you see a Chinese person, and then you see another Chinese person, they just all kind of look like Chinese. And you can't really tell one from the other. And so this has been studied a lot, and then we find that this really is true, that people are programmed to see faces and recognize faces of the kind that they grew up with or that they become familiar with. And you can gain ability at this as you gain experiences in life. So they've even done experiments with monkeys where they raise them away from their tribe of monkeys. They raise them in human environments, and they begin to be good at recognizing human faces, and you put them back in the wild and they're not so good at recognizing monkey faces. Okay, they all just look like monkeys, right? That would be our experience if we came across a tribe of monkeys, unless you're Jane Goodall or something and you live with the great apes or something. They all kind of look alike. It'd be very difficult for us to perceive the differences. Other things that we need to be able to do in order to survive is to perceive depth. And of course, our having two eyes slightly separated helps us to perceive depth, but we take a lot of other clues in order to perceive depth as well. The sizes of images and the way things move with respect to each other and so forth. So what we're going to do now, and unfortunately we couldn't get the remote mouse to work, so I'm going to sit down there. I know that's the person on the mic is going to hate me for that, but we're going to take a moment to see some slides to indicate how we can get fooled. I don't. I think my voice is loud enough, right? It's just people making a recording of it. All right, so how do we make this talk to this thing here? There we go. All right. So here's an image of a picture which is paradoxical, and it's made paradoxical because of shading. At the top it's shaded so that it looks like you've got two pillars, but if you look at the bottom, it looks like you've got three posts. And you look in the middle and you just become totally confused as to what's happening because the shading is all off. So we use these cues of shading to indicate the shapes and sizes of objects and what they're doing. And if that shading has been done skillfully by an artist, it can lead to confusion. Why doesn't the page down work? All right, do it this way. Come on. There we go. All right, you get a similar thing here. Oh, that's right, this thing is way off the screen here, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Can't see the, let's see, can we move it just a little this way so I can see the edge? Because I need to center it.
The screen?
Yeah, if I can see this edge of the screen. Yeah, we just turn this. There we go. So I can see the edge. There we go. Got it. That's fine. I just need to be able to see this. There we go. All right, so here's a similar kind of problem with shading. These stairs are shaded so that it looks like you're going up continually, which of course is impossible. So you start at one corner and you can, if you go counterclockwise, it looks like it's going up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And if you go counterclockwise, it's down and then it looks like it's going down again and down again and down again. And yet you end up in the same place. That's sort of like life, isn't it? We think we're getting somewhere and we find out we're not, haven't gone anywhere. All right, now here's, we try to present three-dimensional images on a flat plane by using various things of perspective. But here the artist has deliberately not used some of the things we might use, like dotted lines or something like that, or a slightly smaller square at one position or the other. And so our perception becomes confused again. Is the yellow square on the top or is it at the back? And you can force yourself to see it one way or the other. So the red dot might be at the back corner, or it might be at a front corner, or it might be on the front face. It just happens to align with the corner. So you can force yourself to see it all different ways, and your brain becomes confused interpreting the information that it's getting. Now here's a room, and it looks like you've got a dwarf and a giant here. But again, it's total fiction. Your brain is being fooled because it assumes that those windows are all the same size, and that the squares on the floor are the same size, and that the room has a flat ceiling. But in reality, it doesn't. It's built like this, so that the guy is standing at that corner with the tiny windows, and I guess it's a girl, it's hard to tell, and the other corner where the windows are much larger, and the whole room is not rectangular. The room gets narrower down where the big person is and larger where the small person is. And because you're only allowed to look through that little peephole of a view window, you can't really use your binocular vision to straighten things out. And it looks like one person's a lot taller than the other. You see, we see this in public life too. If you're not too bright, you surround yourself with people that are even less bright. Now, here's another image of shading, which gets confused. You can see that this, if you follow one surface, it ducks down behind, and yet then where does it go? You can't quite tell where it goes. It just looks like it's a whole scramble of things going around in circles. And the 3D effect of this is very confusing, simply because we're programmed to interpret shading a particular way, and it's not the typical way it should be for a three-dimensional object here. All right, so if we look at the top image, again we see two orange circles and some gray circles, and the two orange circles are actually the same size. But again, by comparison, the one on the left looks a lot smaller than the one on the right, simply by comparison. So we're programmed to see things by comparisons, not actually how they are. In the lower one, this is a much studied image and rather controversial as to the interpretation, but the upper line somehow looks longer than the lower line because of the direction of the little arrow things. On the upper one with the two arrows kind of pointing in and spreading out, it makes the line look longer, and on the lower one with the arrows pointing the other way, it makes the line look shorter. the best explanation I read several, is that the blackness is more concentrated in the lower one, and so it makes our brain think that things are smaller, whereas they're more spread out at the top. Now you see, if you're a contestant on Project Runway or an architect for a building, you need to know these things, otherwise the judges are going to say, well, you've made your model look terribly large or something, or all out of proportion, you see. And so you have to know these things as to how your perception works. Now the gray bar in the middle is all the same shade. It isn't a different shade on one side and the other. And the reason it looks lighter on the left than it does on the right is, again, by comparison. Our brain looks at this and it says, well, there's not much light on the left side of this field. It's like you had a bright light shining into the right side of the room and not the left. And so, because there's not much light shining over there, things aren't as bright. And so, if the middle bar looks light, it must really be light. Whereas on the other side, you got a bright light shining in that corner, and that bar doesn't look very bright, so it must be very dark. But it's actually the same shade all the way across. So this is called the cafe wall illusion. Somebody noticed that a cafe had black and white tiles on the front of the shop, and when you look at it, it looks like the lines are sloping in various directions. But in actuality, they're not. Those are all vertical lines, and your eyes are fooled into thinking they're slanting one way or the other because of the way the blocks are offset. As you offset the blocks a little bit to this side, it looks like the lines converge towards that side. If the blocks are slightly set to the left, then it looks like the lines are slanted towards the left. And so you get this very odd illusion where things that are straight don't look straight. Here's another interesting one. You have these wavy lines, and on every other set of wavy lines, you have dark bands on the downward part of the slope. And on the other ones, you have them on the top the top part of the slope. In actuality, those are all the same shape. They're all just wavy lines, but because we put a dark bar on the downward facing slope, they don't look rounded anymore. They look like they're squared off. And then as you look across the various backgrounds, you can see how your perception changes and how different things stand out. Sometimes the things look like they're going back and out and in that gray one. It looks like they're going out and in rather than up and down. So you get all these various different illusions depending on what the background is and where you put the little black lines. But they're all the same kind of curve. They're not different. Now here we have to ask you to stare at this for at least 30 seconds here. So you just have to stare at it and try not to look away or change where you're looking. You can blink briefly. But this is going to show you about your after image. I don't have one with color. I should have done that too, but I didn't. But this is just a black and white after image. So you just stare at this a while, and so you've got certain rods in your eye that are being fatigued by the white, and the ones that are seeing the black are getting rested. So in a short time here, we'll then stare at a completely white screen, and it'll take your eyes just a few seconds to adjust, but you should see an after image. Yeah. So first you kind of see a white line, and then you begin to see something that kind of looks like a face. Maybe kind of like a Jesus face. It's very interesting. And you don't see that at all in this image up here. I mean, I don't know how you get a face out of that. And yet the after image somehow looks like a face. So you see why we think we see ghosts and things sometimes. These peculiar images. All right, now, as we said, we're programmed to see faces, and so the first thing you see here is a face, but if you look closely, there's no face in that picture, except the horses. There are two horses, and their hooves are forming the eyebrows and the eyes. They've curled their hoof around to form the pupil there. You got a little bird flying over the mountains. You got the purple mountains, majesty back there. And so the whole thing is faked. The face there is not there. It just appears to be there because we're programmed to make faces out of things even when there aren't any faces. Here's another one where we first of all see a skull, but then we notice that it's actually not a skull at all. It's this lady who's at a makeup table and she's looking at herself in a mirror. And she's got all the little makeup things which look like the eye or the teeth of the skulls there. And her hair and the hair of the reflection are the two eyes, sockets of the skull, and so forth. This had a nice name to it and very appropriate for the talk at Vedanta. All is vanity. This lady sitting in the vanity, and of course she at some point the body is just going to be a skeleton. All right, now our brains try to simplify things, take shortcuts, and so when we look at this, we tend to see a bright white triangle sitting on top of a black triangle and three circles. But if you actually analyze it, there's no white triangle there. It's exactly the same color as the rest of the background. And so what you really have is three little carrots and three Pac-Man. But you see, it's much easier for us to think in terms of two triangles and three circles than it is, because those are common. We're used to thinking in terms of triangles and circles. We're not used to thinking in terms of Pac-Man and little carrots arranged like that. It'd be quite an accident that things would be arranged like that. All right, so you can see that our sense organs are programmed to do specific functions. They're not programmed to see things the way they really are. They're programmed to take shortcuts so that we can somehow make sense out of the world fast enough to survive and to find food and so forth. And that's not what we need when we're trying to practice spiritual disciplines. So we have to be thankful to our sense organs that they do their job nicely and then say, now, time to shut up, I'm going to go meditate. Okay, so that's why we close our eyes and we try to sit someplace that's quiet and so forth, in order to, so that the sense organs can take a vacation and not be giving us some false kind of perception. One little postscript, just so you don't get too angry at your sense organs. I mean, it's really not their fault. You know, they're just perceiving information from all this material world, you know, all the atoms that are out there sending messages back in. And you can't trust those little guys, the atoms. They make up everything. So now you get the actual how-to. All right. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Peace, peace, peace.